Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. I have 3 swatches here. 2 were knit flat and 1 was knit in the round. And for all 3 of these, I'm going to be doing a bind off that will help to maintain the twisted rib that we have here and help maintain that as we do the bind off. So the reason I have 2 flat swatches is because on one of them, I will just do the bind off directly. I finished doing the ribbing and I'm going to do the bind off directly. For this second one, I'm going to do the tubular version of that. So you have setup rows after the cast on before you enter into the ribbing pattern, and therefore you'll have setup rows before you go into the bind off procedure. So I will demonstrate that additional step if that's something you want. And it just creates a more rounded edge. It's a tubular type of situation. There is a literal tube at the edge here and just creates a little thicker, rounder finish. And then I have another swatch on needles for in the round. There are some very slight differences with what you do if you are binding off in the round versus if you are binding off flat. You're going to need a spare double point if you're working, or circular needle, depending on how wide your bind off is. This first step might seem really scary to you and you might be afraid to do this with your project. And if you are, then I would suggest knitting a little swatch and practicing on there so that you can understand how it works and not be so scared. So the first step is to pull this needle out. And what you're going to do is let the knit stitches come forward and the purls are want to go to the back. They'll just naturally, you can encourage them a little bit if you need to. And now you're going to recapture these stitches. They are going to be lined up perfectly to just run your needle through. If you want to, you can use a needle 1 or 2 sizes smaller than the one that you use to do your knitting. But I'm just going to thread this needle right back through all of those stitches. They are all sitting exactly the way they need to be sitting on the needle. You don't have to try to remount them, at least not just yet. In order to maintain this twisted effect as you are binding off, you need to remount these stitches. I prefer doing this by turning the work. That way, the stitches that are on this needle are not interfering. So now you need another needle, a third needle, and you're going to enter each of these stitches through that back leg as if you were purling. So it's like purling through the back loop. You're going to enter the needle that way and just transfer it onto this other needle. So you're coming through the back like this. It helps to turn it to face you like this. And the reason I'm doing it from the back is because if I did it from the front and I was sticking my needle in this way, this needle would be in my way. So I'm not dealing with any yarn at this moment. I'm just remounting these stitches. So this is a type of sewn bind off, this grafted bind off. You're going to have to cut the yarn so that you have at least 4 times the width of whatever this is, and that you're going to thread that onto a yarn needle. Now, if you're used to grafting, like sock toes, this process is going to seem very familiar. We do have to do, when you're working with something that's flat, we have to do a setup step. And the setup step is just done one time. You insert your yarn needle through that stitch on the front needle, the knit stitches, the knit through the back loop stitches, as if to purl, and just pull it through. So you're inserting it basically from the middle, the in between the 2 needles, and pointing it toward you outward. And you're going to do the same thing on this one. You're going to enter as if to knit. So from the middle of this work, you're entering and pointing outwards to do that first step, and then you're going to pull it through. And you want to make sure that actually that this yarn is coming under the needle. So you pull it to snug it up, but you don't pull it super, super tight. Now we're coming to the steps that are going to be repeated all the way across. So off of the front needle, you're going to insert as if to knit. So you're pointing toward the center and you let the stitch slide off the needle. You turn your yarn needle and then you come back pointing toward the outside. So you're coming in as if to purl. So some people, when they're grafting, they'll call it knit off, purl on, because you're entering as if to purl. Now off the back needle, we're going to purl off, knit on, and that means that this yarn needle is coming in this back stitch as if to purl. So again, you're coming from the outside toward the center, and you let that needle off, or let that stitch off the needle, and now you go pointing toward the outside, so you're entering as if to knit and letting that stitch stay on the needle. And you want to make sure that this loop stays under the needles as you're snugging things up. So that is going to get repeated over and over. So pointing inward, pointing outward, and then you pull the yarn through. Pointing inward and let it off, pointing outward, out. So if that helps you, the inward, outward, use that. If you prefer the other way, the little chant that people have, where on stitches on the front needle that look like they're knits, you knit off and then purl on. You can think of it that way. And then on the back needle, you would purl off. These stitches look like purls. So you would purl off and knit on. You can think of it either way, as in, out on both needles, or you can base it on what they look like, and that tells you how to treat it. So if you forget where you are, always look where the yarn is attached. If it's attached to a stitch on the back needle, that means the next thing you have to do is on the front needle. And you always do these two maneuvers before you pull the yarn through. That way you won't forget if you've completed your step. As you get toward the end, you're going to take a stitch off and leave a stitch on. Take a stitch off, leave a stitch on. And then the final step would be to take this stitch off and then take that one off. And then pull your yarn through. And then you have completed the bind off, and that edge stitch has the twist just like the rest of the stitches do down below. So now let's look at what we need to do if we want the more tubular rounded edge instead. For this situation, we need to do a couple of setup rows before we can take the stitches off the needle and separate them. For the setup rows, you're going to work knit stitches as they present, and you're going to slip the purl stitches. So these are knit through the back loop stitches, so we're going to knit them through the back loop. And then we need to slip the purl stitches, and we want to slip it with the yarn in front. And then we go back and we knit through the back loop. So slip, knit through the back, slip, knit through the back, the yarn comes in front, slip, yarn's in back to knit. So we are going to turn and the wrong side's facing, and again we're going to work the knit stitches as they present. So these will be regular knit stitches, and again we're going to slip the purl stitches. So we knit the stitch, bring the yarn to the front to slip it, bring the yarn to the back to knit, yarn to front to slip. Now I'm knitting continental, but if you hold the yarn in your right hand, you're still knitting your stitches, bringing the yarn to the front and slipping the purl stitches. And the fact that I'm holding the yarn in my left hand is not relevant. So we've done 2 passes, one across the right side of the fabric and one across the wrong side. We're going to do this one more time. So now we've done our 2 setup rows, and from this point on, the process is the same as it was for the first swatch. We're going to pull this needle out, and the knit stitches are going to come forward, and the other ones are going to go to the back. And now it's pretty obvious that you've got these 2 layers of fabric. You can see that tube now. And so you are going to put these stitches back on the needle. Just slide them through. Actually, I'm going to get a little smaller needle for this one. I'm using one size smaller. I think that works a little easier when you're threading them back through. That last one. There we go. So now we have these 2 separated, and again you can see that we've got these 2 layers of fabric in here. And now we're going to do what we did again with that first swatch, which is we're going to slip these stitches so that they do twist. So I'm going to enter through that back stitch as if to purl, so it's like I'm purling through the back loop, but I'm just slipping it. This is just to remount the stitches so that when you work the grafted bind off, they will come off the needle with a twist as well. Okay, so I've got them on their 2 separate needles, and now again it's the same procedure. So I have the setup step, which is entering from the middle to the outside, pulling the yarn through. So you're entering as if to purl. Again, coming from the middle, pointing toward the outside, so that's entering as if to knit on the back needle, and then pulling the yarn through. And now we do those repeated steps where we go in toward the middle, and that comes off, pointed outward, and then pull the yarn through. It's the same process as just grafting. So now we're at the end again. So we have 2 stitches. We're going to knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. And then with the last 2 stitch, the final step is you knit that one off and purl that one off and pull the yarn through. So now you have this rounded edge. So I could have gone down a needle size when I did the setup rows. I just didn't think of it, but you can do that. I did 4 passes, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can get away with just 2 passes. It will make a little bit of a smaller tube, but that's how you get that rounded edge, and you will continue that those crossed stitches all the way up to the very top. If you want to do that rounded tubular bind off technique, the setup rounds are worked a little bit differently. So I'm just going to do 1 set of setup rounds. So I'm going to do essentially 2 passes and not 4 passes. The first pass is going to be essentially like with the flat round, where you are going to be working those twisted stitches and slipping the purl stitches. And again, you bring the yarn to the front when you're slipping those purl stitches. So I'm finishing this first pass where I've worked the twisted knit stitches and I've slipped the purl stitches. We're going to still have the right side facing us because we're working in the round. This time we're going to slip the twisted knit stitches and we're going to work the purl stitches. When we are slipping the twisted knits, we want the yarn in back. So, and we're going to just maintain the stitch mount. So we're going to enter that stitch, then we bring the yarn to the front, and then we purl the purl stitches. So the yarn goes in the back, we slip as if to purl because we're maintaining the stitch mount, and then we purl that purl stitch. So this is a little bit different than what we've seen before, but once you start getting into your rhythm, it's pretty easy. Okay, so I've done 2 passes, and again, if you wanted a really rounded edge, you could do 2 more passes. Because I'm working in the round, it's very difficult to try to capture all of those stitches, so I'm only going to do half of the round at a time. I'm going to take those stitches off the needle, and I'm going to use a double pointed needle to capture these because I don't have a ton of stitches. And you can always use a smaller needle to capture these stitches than you used to work the stitches, if that is easier for you. Okay, so I've got these 2 on. I want this out of the way, so I'm just going to let that sit on the needle like that. Again, I need to remount these stitches so that they will be twisted when they come off the needle. So I'm turning it to face me, and I'm going to remount those stitches. And again, you can see that gap between these 2 layers from just doing those 2 passes, which is helpful for when you're slipping these stitches to have that gap there. So when you are doing this grafted bind off in the round, you don't need to do those setup stitches. You can just go right to the repeated steps. So on the front needle, we're going to enter pointing toward the center, and then we're going to point outward as we go through the other stitch and pull that yarn through. And then on the back needle, we're coming in toward the center, letting that stitch off the needle, and then pointing outward as we go through the second stitch. And we just keep repeating it. This part is exactly as we did it on the flat swatches. So I will continue grafting this, and then I will come back when I'm getting to the end of this set of double points. I can show you how you then get the next set of stitches on the needle. Okay, I'm at the point now where I just have a couple of stitches left on the needles. So I am going to pull the next batch of stitches off. And you don't have to do the entire half round at one time. You can do smaller sections, but so now I'm going to capture those stitches on the needle. You can recapture these on the same needle. You can remount the ones excluding those 2 because those have already been set up and partially worked. So remounting those stitches. And then you can just slip both of those stitches onto that needle. And now you can continue the grafting, the same process that we've been doing all along. Okay, so now we're getting to the end of the round, and we want to connect this end of the round to the beginning so that we don't have a gap. So we're going to do our regular steps here. We're going to do our final knit off here, and then we're going to come through that first twisted knit stitch of the round. We're going to come in as if to purl this way. And then we're going to let this one off the needle. And then we can see if we can find that purl stitch. Go through the back on here, pull that through. And that will join things in the round so that there's no gap between the end of the round and the beginning of the round. So then we've got our bind off at the top that maintains the twist all the way up to the top edge. That's it for this week's Technique Tuesday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. And over here are some videos that you might find helpful or interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.